what it has to do with is Judgment Day, and God troubling, tormenting. Remember, that's how it's described in Revelation 9. Torment, and that word torment is used elsewhere, with Lot's righteous soul is vexed day by day, or they toiled in rowing when they were trying to row their boat against a storm to reach land, and they could not do it. They toiled in rowing. So extreme frustration, extreme trouble, and that is characteristic of the spiritual judgment God has brought to pass on the world. Wherever you go, and in just about every area, there's trouble. There's trouble. Nothing is as it was before, but things are difficult, complicated, disturbing, and all these things, because the world is the target. It is the object of God's wrath. He is troubling them. So it's God operating behind the scenes that is allowing these things to happen. And a good passage to look at would be Judges 6 and 7 with Gideon and his army, and the magnification of the lamps. There was 300 men, each having a lamp, and the trumpets. The circumstances, where it was late at night and the enemy camp was asleep, they would have had their guards, but the circumstances were ripe for mass confusion and fear to take hold of them. And that account does relate to Judgment Day. And so they break the pitchers, and 300 lights shine, and then they blow the trumpets like they're a huge host, a huge army coming down from a high point, which means they would have had the advantage against them, and it could be 300 companies of men, given all the lights that were shining on the hillside. And immediately the enemy, who was camped and asleep, they woke up, and you know how your days when you're asleep, and they misperceived the strength of the enemy, and they took off running and were killing each other in the confusion, and so they were completely defeated. That tied into 2 Chronicles 20 with the three armies coming to fight Judah, but they never made it to Judah, because en route they began to fight one another. That's God's doing. God is somehow working, and basically it would happen, I suppose, just by lifting his hand of restraint and the protective hand of God that watched over the world, and orchestrated events so carefully over the course of history. Now God is allowing people to sort of crash into one another, to have conflict and infight, and so there too, the armies fought each other rather than the people of God to the death. And what we are witnessing in these things, if we take a step back, yes, as far as we, our own personal experience, we would wish for order. We would desire things to operate smoothly as they always have, but it is not the time for that. God has revealed to us it is the time for confusion. It is the time for his judgment, and we just have to take that into account. And this will come again in every area of life is impacted by the wrath of God upon the world. Now, it is true, though, that you can have a nation or two or a handful that maybe for a time they're operating more smoothly, more orderly, maybe even as before for some period of time within the overall prolonged judgment day, and other nations seem to be falling apart. Well, keep in mind, when God brought judgment on the church was made up of denominations. And denominations are very similar to the idea of nations. The many nations make the world, and numerous denominations made the outward representation of God's kingdom on the earth. All the various Christian churches and denominations. And so when God turned over the church to Satan for its tribulation, its judgment, you had some denominations go haywire and just lose all sight of truth quickly, and others it happened to in a sort of slower process, but they also lost sight of truth. And then you had a few that seemingly was able to hold on to the recognition of truth, at least, like some of the Reformed churches. They at least gave appearance of that, and so yet the whole church had been given over to Satan. Likewise, in the world, you'll find. I was hearing some news reports about Australia, and Australia is, I think, operating out of extreme fear. They have magnified the threat. And that would tie in with what happened with Gideon, and that's God's doing. That's God's doing. We read in Isaiah 24, in Isaiah chapter 24, where God speaks of Judgment Day, and he says in verse 17, "Fear and the pit and the snare are upon thee, O inhabitant of the earth." Well, the pit is hell, because the earth has been turned into hell. The snare is the spiritual judgment, what took place on May 21, and the inhabitants of the earth, all of them are snared in God's trap. But what's the fear? What's the fear? Fear and the pit and the snare are upon thee, O inhabitant of the earth. Well, it's not fear of God. It's not the fear that the Bible speaks of. What fear is upon them? It's the fear of death. But they feel like they're losing sort of hold of their own life, and so it is prompting conflict. It is bringing inner conflict in a nation, amongst its people, and within the society. You have some who are on one side and some who are on the other side, and on every point, medicine, masks, this and that, and this is God's judgment. The fall of the world, the evidence of the fall is division. But the prolonged judgment day is not over. We don't know in with any nation what's going to happen by the time we get to the close of this period, but it's all again under God's control. It's not Satan. It's not the world itself. It's not some conspiracy of nations or plot. Well, maybe they are, but That's not part of what God's doing. God could use any plans of men for his own purposes. And he is he is using all these things to carry out his vengeance. That's an important thing for us to remember. We are not living at any normal period of time, any usual, typical period of time. We're living on the earth in the day of judgment. And just read all that the Bible says about Judgment Day, all the terrible, awful, horrible things the Bible has to say about Judgment Day, and here we are, and yet it's much more mild because it's spiritual. It's spiritual. It's not literal weeping and gnashing of teeth or literal the many of the descriptions in outer darkness. It's spiritual, and we still have some pleasantries. We still have some nice sunny days, and many blessings of life still exist, which is an incredible thing when we do realize it's Judgment Day. And it's a rather mild wrath of God, but it is the wrath of God. And keeping that in mind will help us in viewing what's happening in the world.